So I'd love to see a show of hands. Are you all software engineers, developers? Like, what's your role? If you're an engineer. Okay, so the majority. Now, if your company's anything like my company, the engineers are sort of split off from the operations. And in this case, I'm going to refer to operations as IT, ops, site reliability engineering, sort of anything to do with that umbrella of DevOps. And so, so my story is Humpty Dumpty, story of DevOps gone wrong. I'm Emily Dowdle. I'm a software engineer for Wazi Digital. We're a very small company in the very beautiful, sunny, and mountainous Denver, Colorado, back in the States. I'm super excited to be here in Kyiv with you. I definitely want to talk about DevOps. Who has heard of the children's rhyme, Humpty Dumpty? Okay, all right. So I'm convinced Humpty Dumpty is a story of DevOps gone wrong. And it goes like this. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Now, I have some principal problems with this rhyme to begin with. I think asking horses to do any kind of surgery is absurd. Hooves, they just can't hold scalpels. And on top of that, either all the king's horses and all the king's men are inept or they're not communicating. And I'd bet it's the latter. So if you think about it, Humpty is a deploy. In my mind, Humpty was fine in QA and staging, and then when you deployed, it just was destroyed, okay? Now the site's down, your boss is angry, he's blaming everyone, threatening people's jobs. IT is saying that it's a code issue. The developers are saying it must be a server problem, okay? Everyone's up in arms, blaming each other, defending themselves. It's sheer chaos, okay? Sound familiar? I think it does, because we've all been a part of that deploy, and it's awful. So we've all been there, and the important bit is all the king's horses and all the king's men, they're not communicating. Now, I'm on the dev side of DevOps. I'm a software engineer. So I'm not going to say who the horses are in this situation, but I do believe that on most teams, there is a tension. It could be described as friction, attitude, a general inability to tolerate one another without eye rolls and audible sighs. What I like to call good old Southern style passive aggressiveness. Now, if none of you have ever traveled to the Southern United States, let me tell you that no one has mastered the backhanded compliment quite like them. They have this saying, bless your heart. And just know that if you travel there and someone says that to you, it's not a compliment. It just doesn't have to be this way. I think we can do better than that. I think that if we, as developers, as engineers, if we're going to solve problems, real world, critical, exciting problems, the kind that get our hearts pumping and make us want to leap out of bed in the morning, I think we're going to have to change our attitudes and solve our own problems in our team. I think the problem with this is change is really hard, and it's a lot of responsibility that you have to take on. You know, some days when I get into work, especially on Mondays when I haven't had my coffee, again, and I want my boss to come in and tell me exactly what to do, you know, to take all the ownership and responsibility to make that final call, because it's really hard to self-manage, you know? Letting your manager make all the decisions, that's the easier path. But I don't think it's the right one, and I think we can do better as a team. I think making our jobs awesome is our job. So the question is, if you're feeling like that bulldog, like, yeah, we've heard this before, how do we make that happen? I think to look forward, we have to look back. We have to think about the history, the decisions and processes, the things that got us into this sort of mess to begin with. And one of those things is, like it or not, developers, their performance is measured pretty much by how many features they deploy. I can bet that if all of us took off this month and worked on tackling that growing mound of tech debt and all of our code bases, it'd be great for us. We'd feel really great about it. But at the end of the month, when we haven't developed or haven't deployed any kind of feature, the latest and greatest idea from our marketing departments, we're going to be pulled into someone's office and sternly asked why. But see, operations, they're measured on a totally different way. They're measured on site reliability and performance and uptime. Now, lots of people like to throw around these numbers. Oh, our site is up for 5 nines. And so that's 99.999% of the time. And if you don't feel like pulling out your calculators and doing the math, that means that your site can only be down for a little over 5 minutes a year. That's like 5 minutes a year. That's crazy. And so that's super hard. And I have a lot of empathy for that job because honestly, I don't want it. I think this leads to a lot of conflict. We have different priorities. It causes us to butt heads. I think that's natural and it's okay. So essentially, developers must release features in order to be successful, but deploys are the #1 cause of site outages. So there's an inherent problem here. No wonder we're natural enemies. I think this puts us in a vicious cycle. Okay? You have these developers on the left, this absurdly happy dog. They get excited about features, they code it, and then they want to deploy it right away, and I get that. I have been there. But it also leaves all the responsibility on operations, and they end up looking sometimes and feeling like Grumpy Cat, you know? They're the ones that have to say, no, this isn't a good idea, or let's stop and slow down, or we need to change some configurations before we can do this. It's not really fair. I think that everyone deserves to feel like this absurdly happy dog. I mean, look at this guy. Like, if I felt like that every time I walked into work, I would never leave my job. I think all of us deserve that level of passion, and I have some ideas about how we can get there. I know most of you aren't in operations, but if you take this back to your team, here's a few messages I have for them. I want them to empower the devs, okay? And that starts with trusting your team. If a developer says that their code works, he or she actually believes the code works. They're not lying on purpose. They don't want to make your life a living hell, okay? They actually believe that. So let's just show mutual respect and assume that they work. I want us to bridge the skills gap, okay? Ben Traynor of Google describes site reliability engineering as what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations function. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I would bet 90% of our miscommunications are conflict. It's probably based in a skills gap. It just means that the person you're speaking with, they don't use the tech stack or tooling that you use every day. And so there's this really simple solution to this. You teach them, okay? You spend 2 hours a day pairing and looking at the code together. You document all your configurations and code well. You make it easy for developers to find solutions independently so they don't have to keep bugging you. Because sometimes I feel like I'm bugging you. You have to give developers access to read-only logs. So I'm not saying hand out root access like candy. I'm simply saying that allow developers to get some kind of feedback on whether their code works or not. Because I don't think, as an operations person, anyone wants to be copying and pasting an error message every 5 minutes. It's a waste of time, you know? You have better things to do. So let me get some feedback on my things. After all, developers, their code runs on your systems. You have to have some kind of level of trust there. And anyway, you can't expect someone to jump in and help out after a bad deploy if they don't have access to things. Please create consistent platforms. I want you to pay attention to parity between environments, okay? Making sure that the data and the resources are the same, especially in QA and staging. Staging and production should be identical, in my opinion. It's okay for dev to be a little bit stepped down. That's just sort of like the first landing zone. But outside of that, they need to be almost identical. Otherwise, deploys will be a roll of the dice. I want you to share source control. Keeping your configurations up on GitHub in the same location as all your other code makes it super easy to find what someone's looking for. It also makes you feel a lot more like a team. If I can see your code and you can see my code, then it's not going to feel so much like I'm lobbing things over at you to deploy and support. I believe code is code. Okay, this one's somewhat controversial, but I think developers should be on rotation. Okay? I dare you to wake me up. I think that being on rotation, or on-call rotation, which means if the site goes down, you get a call, it really helps take ownership of the site. And when I'm thinking like that, if I'm aware that I'm going to be woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning and stumble through the dark toward my brightly lit computer, I'm going to think a little bit broader about how I'm coding. Thinking about situations, knowing what machines how many can fall down before the site comes offline completely. Those bigger concepts, I think, are driven home by the fact that you are on call. Simplify deploys. I know we talked a lot today about continuous deployment and making those really small iterations. It's a really good idea. For a good reason. It makes it really easy to find the problem after you deploy. Okay? I think unnecessary steps to deployment, it increases the likelihood of an issue, and it also decreases the number of people who can deploy. And empowering your developers starts by letting them deploy to different environments, okay? If I can't deploy my code to QA, staging, or production, I'm sorry. You deserve to put out the fire on your own. Now that we've covered operations, I have some choice words for developers. Cut the attitude. A little empathy goes a long way, okay? We've all been there, been grumpy. Just don't be an asshole. Be nice. You can't avoid talking to your operations team at all costs and then throw a bunch of code over to them to blindly deploy and support for you. It's not fair. This brings me to planning together. If you're thinking about a feature, include operations in the first meeting. This goes before you ever write a single line of code. Discuss what the feature is, why it's important, what'll change, what are the risks, who needs to be involved. And then listen. I'm sure they'll have some really great ideas. Spending an hour in a meeting, I know we all hate meetings, but that will be time well spent compared to the chaos of the site being down and trying to scramble together a solution. Trying to solve problems then, not a great idea. Just like deploy should be simple, our changes should be simple. If a feature requires you to change 30% of your app's most messy spaghetti code, it's too big. Okay, the risks of that is too large. So I work with media a lot. I do a lot of video. So if I'm transcoding, which means making multiple different types of a video, like MP4, things like that, that would be separate than streaming it to my viewers. Those are two totally different things. The thing I like to measure a feature on would be the same rule I use for method naming. If my method name needs an and in the middle of it, if it does two things, it's too big. Just make it smaller, okay? Tools like Jira allow you to make these epics and stories and then break it all into small tasks. We can all work on different little features and make it a lot more simple. Communicate. So you know how you already included operations in your first meeting? Awesome. Keep talking to them. Anytime you deploy something, anytime you need to change something, keep that communication open. I think a lot of teams use Slack or HipChat and they have an incident channel. And that's a first start. That's good because operations and developers, they're there together. They can communicate. But I like to have another channel, what I like to call just a happy channel, where you can kind of talk about your families and your sports game on whatever weekend. Building those relationships, it matters. In times of crisis, when you like someone, it's going to be a lot easier to deal with them. I promise. Who here knows what improv is? No. Okay, so improv is, it's like a type of acting, and two actors get up on stage with no script, okay? They just sort of work off of each other. And they build a scene. So they'll have a theme, but there's nothing to go off of. They're building it completely on their own. And one of the rules of improv is you must use yes and rather than yes but. So for an example, if the scene is someone wants to buy a car from a dealership, and one actor plays the buyer and one actor plays the dealer, if the actor says, "Hi, I'd really like a blue car," then it's up for the dealer to not say, "Oh, well, I don't have any blue cars," because it creates a friction. It puts the two actors at odds. Okay, they're working against each other. Instead, he should say yes and. So, I love the fact that you want a blue car. I just got 5 cars in. And so it's a really small language change, but in meetings, if you build off someone's idea, if you think about it and add to it, rather than saying like, no, that's not gonna work. It validates them and makes them feel heard. Goes a long way. Let's stay open. If someone in operations says there's gonna be a problem, let's assume there's going to be a problem, okay? My core competency is writing great software. Their core competency is site uptime and reliability. So I have to trust that they know what they're talking about. Let them help you. I promise that the solution you come to together will be a lot better than the one you came up with on your own. And it's not that you're not smart. Everyone in this room is brilliant. But two brilliant people will always come up with a better idea than one. And finally, be humble. Show some humility. If someone got woken up in the middle of the night because your code deploy brought down the site or a service, say sorry, okay? Buy them a cup of coffee, they're tired. Be nice. Take responsibility for your mistakes. When you do that, it's much less likely that your colleagues are gonna be making voodoo dolls of you and keeping them by your bed. Finally, after I've covered all the things that we can do independently, I really want to talk about what we do together. And for me, that's embracing failure. Failure happens. Like, we will fail. It's just life. We're human. And that's totally okay. Until Skynet hits, we're stuck just dealing with it. It's totally possible that your deploy could bring down the site, that your typo could cause a server to come offline, bring users to Twitter fisticuffs. I believe in using the 80-20 rule for failure. And that basically means it's okay to spend 80% of your time trying to avoid failure. I get that. But 20% of your time at least needs to be practicing what happens when you do fail, okay? If you only spend time trying to avoid it, then when it actually happens, it's going to be 1,000 times worse than if you had put any thought into how you handle that situation. So the best example of this is flying, okay? So every time we get on an airplane, I half ignore the safety talk. It's like, okay, we get it. Seatbelts, air, whatever. But I'm super happy that someone put some thought into what happens if the plane crashes or, the raft needs to deploy, whatever the situation is. Because it means that when it does happen, however improbable, we're prepared. That's a good thing, right? I love this saying, leave your ego at the door. So I know it may not be believable. I'm a competitive powerlifter. I know I'm not big or burly, but you'd be surprised at how many normal people show up to lifting meets. And when I started lifting seriously, I joined a team in Florida, and it was 5 these incredibly strong people, okay? And the lead guy, he was this 60-year-old, bald, traps up to here. He looked like Bane, a real juggernaut of a man. He was highly intimidating. And he had one rule, and it was leave your ego at the door. And I love that, okay? It didn't matter that every time I went up to squat, we had to strip 400 pounds off the bar. It just mattered that I listened, I learned, and I respected the team. I think we could learn a lot by applying that to just our everyday life. Don't point fingers, okay? It never feels good to make a mistake. And when 20 people are required to fix a mistake that I caused, I feel awful, okay? I'm embarrassed. And then when people double down and I feel attacked, I feel blame, then I get defensive, okay? I think a lot of us would feel the same way. It just doesn't feel good. So let's just give everyone a little bit of slack. It could happen to all of us. All of us will make a mistake. And I like to celebrate it, If I bring down the site in a glorious fashion, let everyone know. It's kind of a badge of honor. And if that happens, I believe strongly in postmortems. Does everyone know what a postmortem is? Okay. It's a term that gets thrown around in DevOps quite a bit. And the other name for it is root cause analysis. And more or less, it's an informal meeting staged after a disaster to discuss what happened. So for me, they're not optional. If something goes wrong, you simply hold one. Don't leave it up to the enthusiastic junior to throw a flag on the play every time something happens. You have to just make it part of your workflow. So if something goes wrong, if the site goes down, whatever, within 48 hours, hold a postmortem. talk to each other. And while you're there, you should focus on these 8 questions. They center around what happened, who was involved, and how the team can rectify it, if they need to. Occasionally, some things happen and they're a one-off. We don't need to over-engineer everything, but we should think and talk about it. Now, they're supposed to be blameless. And I put this in air quotes because, they're never really blameless. If it's my fault, it's my fault. But the difference is that I'm not being fired because of that. I can openly and honestly admit what happened, why I made that decision, and talk about how we can make processes to prevent that in the future. If you have someone in your organization, I'm looking at usually a VP of sales, who demands that someone be fired every time something goes wrong, then the answer is always your boss. If your boss isn't willing to be that sort of shit umbrella, then maybe you should change bosses. I think that failure is spread amongst the team. Responsibility is always shared. And failure, again, should be celebrated. It's how we learn. It's important. So to sort of wrap things up, I think making our job awesome is our job. And I really hope that I've given you a few ideas of how to improve your own job, your relations with your operations team, and take these things back to your job. Again, I'm Emily Dowdle. You can find me at emily@emilydowdle.com and on Twitter at editingemily. Thank you. I'm open to questions if you have any. Sure.
Have you got any kind of war stories from JavaDay to DevOps from your kind of practical experience?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the most recent example, we didn't bring down the site, thank goodness, but what happened was we had just cut over a completely new site for a client, and we released 12 features at the same time because they kind of wanted to release them all at the same time, which makes sense from a business perspective, but it causes problems, as I'm about to share. So one of those features was photo sharing, and it was a marketing management system. So like they could upload photos and change it, and it was automatic, okay? Well, that started not working and in production. And it had previously not worked in QA. And we had identified the issue as a problem with the CDN. We were using Akamai. And so when it came up in production, our project manager was like, hey, Emily, looks like your feature's not working. And I was like, well, it worked in every other environment. It should work now. I'm guilty of the same attitude. And so I asked operations, was like, hey, what do the logs say? And I don't know. Like, really? Okay. You want to look it up? You want to take some responsibility here? I was highly suspicious because of the issue we had solved in QA. And I had 20 minutes before another sort of important meeting. So I was feeling very stressed. And I think that's what happens. Like our worst moments happen when we're worried about something else, So it ended up being resolved. It was a CDN issue. I was right. Yes. But yeah, I definitely wish we had like more communication like this and a more open team. Anything else? Yeah.
Could you describe what practices do you use for incident management?
So like when
you have a chart like a communication channel, but you need to apply some approaches to handle this chart. So maybe some responsible people rotating and so on.
Oh, so you mean like on call, like making sure everything's... Oh.
When something happens not on production environment, but on your own infrastructure, like on staging environment, on CI/CD pipelines and so on.
Yeah.
Do you use something for this?
We don't have any formal way of doing that. I think that'd be an awesome product. If anyone wants that idea, go for it. Yeah, I think just when something happens on an environment, I just check the logging and see what happened, try and get some feedback.
My question is more related. How do you understand that you are responsible and how to find people who has the best knowledge that could be applied in this case?
Yeah. I mean, my solution is just to ask. Like, usually I have a hunch of who would be the best person to ask, and so I start there, and then if they sort of like pass it along, just follow the breadcrumbs and try and figure it out. But I don't have a perfect answer for that. I think that's a problem.
And another question, could you describe some cases when you was like on the first line of production support? You or your colleagues, I mean developers.
Yeah. So at my company, we're not on call. And it's something I disagree with. And I talked about it. Because, I mean, I have a friend who says, if you build it, you support it. And I strongly agree with that. I think that it should be shared. And so, I definitely think developers should be on call. And if you share those documentation, if you bridge that skills gap, it'll be easier for them to solve small problems. They may have to call DevOps or operations at some point, but it would be a next step. It wouldn't be an immediate thing.
But do you think the developers could handle such calls?
I think if you document things and if you share code and if you actually build a culture where DevOps is a more of a culture and not a developers or operations or just another department, which is kind of becoming, I think it's totally possible. They may not be the best. Again, like their core competency is writing great software. But I think if you bridge that skills gap, if you teach them, they'll be able to handle smaller issues. So if something is like a complete disaster, yeah, you're probably going to have to call multiple people in. But I'd argue that even someone in operations may have to do that with a big issue. I hope that answers your question. Okay.